All righty, there we go. And all right, I think we are all set. So thank you all for being here today. I know that sometimes afternoons can be busy, but I was hoping to catch teachers before your super busy season starts when kids come back to school. So I know there's probably classroom teachers, homeschool teachers, and really anybody who is working with kids and helping them learn something new hopefully will benefit from our presentation today. So one thing I would ask is that if you have a question, you can put that in the chat, and I will either answer it kind of as we go, or if I know that I'm going to be getting to that, then we will just wait and I'll answer it as we go. So anyway, but we're going to try and keep this to around 45 minutes so that we do have time for questions and answers at the end, because I did have 1 to 2 o'clock dedicated. So, all right. So we are going to be focusing on sensory processing today and how that impacts learning and what we can do to support and assess those kids who maybe have stronger sensory preferences and need a little bit more support. So the first thing I'd like to show is just how our sensory system impacts academic learning, daily activities, and behavior. So this is a pyramid that I think really shows nicely the impact of sensory processing on the rest of development. So if we were to look at development like a pyramid, you see up there at the top that academic learning, daily living activities, and behavior are kind of where we hope our kids strive and succeed. And that takes a lot of cognition and intellect. Below that are all of those sensory motor and perceptual motor skills that also should just be fairly automatic in order for the child to do their best at the top of the pyramid. So these things are things that should just sort of happen without the child having to put a lot of brain energy into them. At the very bottom then of that pyramid is our sensory system. And so you see the 7 different sensory systems there. We're going to add an 8th one, including interoception, to our discussion today. So we're going to really be focusing on the bottom of the pyramid. So again, if these are bricks and we start to mess with those bricks and something isn't quite as stable and as strong as it should be, it's just going to disrupt the rest of the development. And so it can really have a big impact on what you guys are doing in the classroom as teachers. So our sensory systems are listed here. I think those top 5 are the ones that we most often hear about and talk about, and perhaps you're even teaching your students about hearing, taste, smell, sight, and touch. They're all pretty self-explanatory, but the bottom 3 are maybe a little lesser known. So movement or vestibular is really our head position and how we are moving, what direction we are moving. So we can be moving in a linear pattern, we can be moving up and down, we can be moving in diagonals, and we can be also spinning upside down. And it gives us a lot of information about some of our other sensory systems. So our vestibular system is partially housed in our inner ear, and that's how we detect movement in those various directions. It also tells us information about how fast we are moving. And so it gives us a physical reference to our world around us. So even our visual system is developed and enhanced through our vestibular system. And so our vestibular system, because it's so closely related to sound and sight, it often helps build the foundation for handwriting, for physical activities, for using the two sides of the body together. And certain research has even shown that to a certain extent, we all even listen better if we are moving. And so you probably have been able to notice this with your students, especially those ones that are seeking out movement and really needing that extra movement during their day. So, you know, we really can support speech and language and learning by incorporating movement into a regular schedule and activities for kids. So, proprioception receives input from your muscles, joints, and tendons. And so this has a lot to do with our brain understanding where the rest of our body is in relationship to each other. So this has a lot to do with knowing how much force to use, either, when we're playing with somebody else. So, how hard do I need to be throwing that ball in order to get it to my friend, but not knocking them over? Or how hard do I need to be pushing my pencil down on my paper so that I'm not tearing the paper and I'm getting, the right amount of pressure? And so, again, very important sensory system for academics as well as social skills, behavior, play, that type of thing. So, the interoception sense is probably the least explored sensory system among people who, are not kind of those sensory system, I don't know, geeks, but it has a lot to do with how our brains are processing how our body feels. And so our interoception tells us, do I have to go to the bathroom? Am I hungry or am I full? Am I hot or am I cold? It helps us, be able to know, why we maybe have a stomach ache. And so our interoception sense also has a lot to do with behavior and regulation, especially in those kids who maybe have been working with somebody to come up with strategies to help keep them calm or help keep them alert and focused, but they don't seem to be using the strategies. Oftentimes, then we really start to question and wonder, are they receiving the signals or understanding the signals that their body is giving them? So, in order for me to know that I need to do something to help calm myself, I have to be able to understand and interpret that maybe when I'm anxious, I start to sweat, or my heart rate increases, or maybe I get a little stomach ache. And if my interoception sense is off and I'm not necessarily interpreting that, then I may have difficulty then using the strategies. So again, a very important sensory system that might not get as much credit as it should regarding being alert and also being calm. So what is sensory processing? So sensory processing is just that normal, everyday neurological procedure of organizing the information that we're taking in from our bodies and the world around us. And so we are constantly taking in sensory information, and it's impacting us all throughout the day. So even thinking about yourself and where you might be listening to this, you maybe are, sitting in a quiet room in your home and there isn't much going on around you. And so you have, full attention on what you're hearing. Some of you might be sitting in a room similar to the one that I am, and I have a window right here, and there's trucks driving by. There's, the fire department and police station are right across the street. And so, I'm getting all of that input, and maybe it's, taking me a little bit more to not be distracted by that. And so even, the chair that you're sitting in, are you comfortable? Perhaps you just ate lunch and you're getting information about whether or not you ate too much, or whether, maybe you haven't eaten yet. So now you're getting information about being hungry. And all of those things are impacting how you are able to pay attention and focus on what we're doing here. So what is sensory processing disorder or dysfunction? It's not an actual diagnosis, but we do know that neurological disorganization does occur for people, for kids, for adults, and that results because of three different things that might be happening in the brain. So the first thing could be that the brain isn't receiving or detecting messages as it should. So, you know, there are things happening around us, but sometimes if it isn't sensory enough, or think loud, think bright, think heavy movement, that type of thing, sometimes our brain might not receive or detect that message. The second thing that might happen is that our brain is inefficient in taking that information and then doing something with it, whether that's integrating it into the brain, organizing it, providing information to us to make a decision about what we've just experienced. The third thing that might happen is that the brain may send out an inaccurate message to direct the child's actions. So, this would be the case where, imagine you're walking across the street, and because curbs are always usually about the same height, we don't necessarily have to think a whole lot about stepping up onto a curb, okay? Because we've done it over and over and over again, and our brain just knows how high the curb is. However, sometimes your brain maybe tells your foot, correctly how high to lift it, but sometimes that might not happen, and you catch your toe on the curb and you end up falling or tripping. And so that would be an example of sending out an inaccurate message to direct your action. So, all right, when we work with kids, we often will do a sensory profile, which just gives us more information about the child's sensory preferences. And so these are the four categories that we are able to determine by doing a sensory profile. So a sensory profile is a questionnaire that parents complete. There are school companion sensory profiles that can be completed also by the teacher, because we definitely know that sometimes the way we act one place is different than how we maybe act in another environment. And so getting information from both places at times can be beneficial. So we're going to go through each of these four sensory profile categories in a little more depth, but just understand that all of us are somewhere on a continuum of either needing a lot of sensory input, so that would be a high sensory threshold. That would mean that, we need things to be more sensory rich. So we need things to be maybe multi-sensory cues, or we need things to be louder, brighter, or maybe we need to be moving. Regarding, food or oral intake, maybe we need the food to be spicy. And so that would be a high sensory threshold. The opposite side of that is the low sensory threshold, and that would be where you don't need as much sensory input in order to detect and notice that sensory input. And so these sensory profile categories are based off of those thresholds. So the first one we're going to talk about is the registration bystander. And so registration bystanders have that high threshold, so they need a lot of input. They are going to, though, be passive in how they respond or get that high threshold. So these kids or adults need a lot of sensory input, but because they're passive, they aren't necessarily going to seek that out. And so if something isn't sensory enough for them, they will just maybe appear to have be a little more apathetic. So they might look as if they have low energy levels, or they are tired. They oftentimes, these kids are really good babies because they just kind of go with the flow because they aren't necessarily getting enough cues. So they aren't necessarily responding like they should. So the recommendation for these kids is that we provide them with sensory rich environments so that that threshold can be met, and that way the child can notice and respond appropriately to those cues. So these would be kids who definitely need like the multi-sensory cues. They need more than just you telling them, what page to open up in the math book, but they maybe need it written on the board also. Maybe they need you to put your hand on their shoulder while you're giving them an instruction, just to add that tactile input as well. The sensitivity seekers also have that high neurological threshold, but these kids are going to be very active to make sure that that threshold gets met. And so they are continuously, engaging with others. They may appear a bit fidgety or overly excitable. These might be the kids who are constantly touching others and things on their desk, and really might be ones who kind of crash into kids when they're waiting in line just because they need a lot of sensory input. And so again, what we want to do for these kids is incorporate that additional sensory input into their routine so that that threshold can be met in appropriate ways, so that they aren't needing to seek out inappropriate things in order to have that sensory threshold met. The avoider will be the first one we talk about with the low threshold. Avoiders, and as what I would say is in our clinics, we oftentimes will see the avoiders and the sensory seekers as well as the sensitivity sensors. They're just the ones that usually are identified more quickly compared to the bystanders. So the avoiders have that low sensory threshold. So it does not take much for them to have that threshold be met. And oftentimes it's met too often. And so this can become uncomfortable or frightening for the child. So these are the kids who usually have meltdowns or outbursts to get out of situations. They might be ones who are, crawling under their desks, eloping, just because that threshold has been met and it's really uncomfortable for them. So they are often resistant to change. Transitions can be difficult for them. They like to know what the routine is and stick to the routine. And so really what we want to do for the avoiders is limit unfamiliar input, and maybe prepare them when things are not going to be the same and outside of that routine. But also we want to broaden that sensory processing range so that not everything seems as new and novel, and they can begin to explore their environment and experience things, but all within kind of that acceptable range. And so, we do that by introducing things in a safe manner. So, think about those kids who maybe have some tactile issues. So touch might be difficult. And so you're going to do an activity, say with shaving cream, and the avoiders are, probably going to want tools or something for them to be able to engage and participate in the activity rather than just their hands. And so even kind of thinking differently about some of those types of activities and realizing that, they can participate, it might just look a little different than what some of the seekers are doing. And sometimes they even just need a little more time with an activity in order to become comfortable with it and participate. The sensitivity sensors are also that low neurological threshold, and these students or kids have a tendency to, again, be passive in that. So they aren't necessarily having the meltdowns and the outbursts, but they are being very distracted and may come off as being a little hyperactive. They are going to respond to the newest thing that comes along. So oftentimes their attention will be pulled from what they're doing to, say somebody comes walking in your classroom or somebody else drops their pencil on the floor. They are going to notice that and have their attention drawn to that and maybe stop what they're doing. And so for these kids, you want to provide sensory experiences that help support them, but they don't necessarily need more sensory input. They just need the right kind of sensory input. And so we, will be getting to some of those activities that the low threshold kids can definitely benefit from. So modulation is our brain's ability to either ramp something up for us or dampen it so that it becomes more at the right level. And so when we have kids who do the sensory profile and they are kind of scattered between maybe the high and the low thresholds, sometimes maybe they'll score as a sensitive or sensory seeker in movement, but there may be an avoider in sound. And so we see that some areas are different than the others. And so then what we have to wonder is there a modulation issue going on? And so when we see that modulation issue, again, like I mentioned previously, sometimes those kids just need more time in order to have their brain get used to the task or used to the environment. So, one of the examples I like to use the most is, you can go to a loud concert. Um, and so for myself, I'm not a big fan of loud noises. And so if I get to a concert because I think, oh, this would be really fun to go to, I oftentimes will, initially sit down and it'll be, way too loud. And I'll think there's no way I'm going to be able to stand to sit here this long. Well, eventually it starts to feel like it's not quite as loud as what it was when I first got there. Well, that's because my brain was able to modulate and in essence, get used to what's going on. And so then that allows me to be able to stay and enjoy myself. So um, self-regulation is our ability to be able to either, again, make ourselves be alert and focused or help us bring our arousal level down to be calm. And that is completed through our brain's ability to use sensory input to help us be able to either become alert or be able to calm down. So, the example I would give is let's say you have to drive late at night um, and you're getting really, really sleepy. Well, it's probably not super effective for you to be, constantly telling yourself, stay alert, pay attention, don't fall asleep. But if you stopped the car, got out, moved a little, maybe walked around, maybe you blow cold air in your face, maybe get yourself a snack or something to drink, you probably, know whether or not public radio and talk radio are going to be more alerting for you, or maybe a certain type of music. So those are all sensory things that you've done in order to improve your level of alertness. And so that is all accomplished through different endorphins that are released to your brain in order to help improve that level of alertness. All right, so this is a handout that I really, really love. And so this one is, these are all of our different sensory categories. And this is developed through studying the brain. It's part of the How Does Your Engine Run curriculum. Patricia Otter is the one who developed this. So when we have studied the brain, we know that taste and smell and oral texture are the easiest sensory systems for our brains to process. So if you look over there, as you're facing it on the left side, those are going to be the most calming sensory inputs for us, because if something is easy, it often then will be calming. And so also thinking about like babies, right? So babies, when they're upset, we will often give them something to suck and something in their mouth, and it will help calm them down. And so taste and smell, oral texture is a really, really awesome tool to be able to use to help with that self-regulation. So as we move from left to right, we're going to go through the tactile, movement, gravity categories. Those all, as we go from left to right, become more difficult for our brain to process and therefore more alerting. So way over on the right side of the screen, you're going to see visual and auditory. So those are the most difficult sensory categories for us to process. Therefore, they are the most alerting. And if you think about, your classrooms, you're probably spending quite a bit of time in visual auditory. And so those sensory categories can be quite stimulating. As we go from top to bottom, we're also going to progress from calm to alerting. And so if we go back to taste and smell, sweet vanilla is going to be much more calming than bitter smoke. And so, if you think about a bitter taste such as coffee, that's going to be much more alerting than something sweet. As you go down from tactile. So joint and muscle activity or neutral warmth is going to be much more calming than light touch or unexpected touch, and extreme temperatures, which is way at the bottom. That'll be much more alerting. So think about tickling versus a deep pressure heavy hug. Two totally different things, and you get two different responses. Movement activity. So again, that joint and muscle activity going to be much more calming, regulating compared to spinning. So does that mean that spinning is never appropriate? Not at all. Especially for those sensory seekers, they are going to benefit from spinning because they need more sensory input. And so, even thinking about recess time and playground time, if you have things on your playground that spin, the seekers, you might want to guide them toward those spinning activities. Jumping or bouncing and swinging, extremely good for organizing the brain. So, if we think about kind of neurological organization, so that's where, maybe you're not sure, does this kiddo need more input or less input? Think about going to those organizing categories. So if you were going to look at those middle two rows and the middle three columns, so looking at, starting with salt and brine and sour citrus and going all the way across to rhythmical music and vocalization or speech sounds, those are going to be considered organizing. And so, think about, again, late at night, you're trying to stay alert and focused to maybe finish watching the Olympics or a movie. You might choose a crunchy, salty snack, or maybe you pop a piece of gum in your mouth, because that is going to be organizing for your brain and help you achieve what you need at that time. So I also mentioned the middle three columns, so tactile all the way over to vestibular gravity. Those are also going to be considered organizing for the brain. And if you look at like joint and muscle activity, so, oftentimes we'll talk about like heavy work. Heavy work is anytime you can load up those joints and muscles and do something that's going to engage that. That's going to be a really good organizing, a bit more calming activity compared to the spinning. And so that's one of the things that I will oftentimes recommend if we aren't, maybe we haven't done the sensory profile and we aren't exactly sure whether or not a kiddo is a seeker or are they an avoider, because those two can look similar until you really investigate. Usually, doing heavy work or providing deep pressure heavy touch is can be well received and can be a good thing to do until we have a little bit more definite plan. So if you're look then at the way bottom right side of the screen, you'll see language. So language is the very most difficult thing for our brains to process. And so, again, where are a lot of the kids spending a lot of their day in that language area? And so this is, probably why it's so important to get them out and doing recess and physical activity, because are going to have a tendency to be overstimulated, just because of the two areas that they're spending a lot of their time. So at the bottom here, you'll see that we can change our optimal function by changing some of the variables. So if you think about a child who could maybe benefit from jumping on a trampoline constantly, but you know that that's not possible, right? Because you can't jump constantly. We can change maybe some of the other variables. So instead of the duration being, 8 hours a day, we can change how often, the frequency of how often they're doing that. So maybe, they jump when they first arrive at school, and then they jump, at morning recess, and then they jump after lunch. And so now we've added some jumping on a mini trampoline frequently throughout the day in order to give them the input that they need. Or maybe that's not even feasible to jump that often. So then maybe we change the intensity, and you tell that student to jump as high as they can for 1 minute. And so they're going to get, more input in a shorter period of time than if they were just doing little jumps. And most of the sensory strategies, sensory categories can be changed through those different variables. So even, the mouth. So we know that sucking through a straw can be really calming, but maybe water bottles aren't allowed on desks at your school. Well, maybe they could suck through a littler straw, but more frequently throughout the day, versus just having constant access to a straw. Or maybe you change, what is in the water bottle. So maybe it has a little bit of a sour taste to it. So lemonade, or something like that, is going to be a little bit more alerting than just water. And so, again, we can change the variables there in order to get what we need from the input. All right, so now we're going to go just through some specific activities that you can do in your classrooms. Some of these we've already talked about, so I might not point them out, but these would be considered those, again, organizing sensory input activities, because, and so even when you think about your classroom, right, like let's say you have 20 students, you might have, 7 sensory seekers and 5 registration bystanders, and so you've got a mix of kids. And so the organizing sensory input activities are probably going to be ones that almost everyone can benefit from, and are going to be the most helpful. If you aren't able to, obviously it's not feasible to be having one kiddo do one thing and 3 of them doing something else. And so these are going to be just kind of more general activity ideas. So limiting, a lot of auditory input from the environment. And so maybe it's nice to have music on at certain times of the day, because music can be a really good sensory input and can be really helpful at certain times, but limiting some of that auditory input at other times where maybe they need to have more concentration, or you're working on language, that type of thing. Reducing the loud surprise factor. So, oftentimes kids probably don't respond real well, to a fire drill or something like that. And so sometimes you aren't able to prepare them, but if you have kids who really don't do well in those types of activities, maybe giving them a heads up. Again, that linear and oscillating movement, so swinging, jumping, can be really good. So even, incorporating some of that into your activities, even in the classroom, like maybe they're just, doing some jumps next to their desk, can be just a good, brain break for them. If you are in a school where you have snacks, like snack recess or something like that, um, letting parents know that, crunchy snacks, chewy snacks are going to be a good option. So even like apples can be a good fruit to take, or like the little, tangerines are a little bit more sour, and can be a good organizing, regulating activity. And then deep, firm pressure touch. So if you're going to, put your hand on, a student's shoulder or something like that, having it be a more firm touch. Outlining the schedule for the day can be really helpful, especially for those sensory avoiders who rely on routines, and understanding, if something is going to be different. So yeah, discussing those unexpected events, giving a bit of a warning prior to transitions, um, limiting kind of all of extraneous visual material. So thinking about how busy is my classroom visually. Bulletin boards are awesome, especially if they provide information. But if there's something that doesn't have to be hanging up, or, maybe hanging from the ceiling, it might end up being more distracting, even though it might look cute or look nice. And then if you're able, having cubbies or folders, so that you can kind of organize some of those visual materials for students. Having a quiet or a relaxation corner for kids, especially those who need maybe to have a little bit of a separation. Um, Breathing activities are always really good. You're engaging the mouth as well as getting some good endorphin release through those breathing activities. So there's lots of different fun breathing activities that you can find that even, incorporate like some visual tracking or counting, that type of thing. Wall push-ups or chair push-ups, so that's going to engage joints and muscles. And so even just having your students sitting in their chairs, and you have them put their hands on the seats and lift their bottoms up off of the chair. And so that's a great way without having everybody to have to get up and transition and move. Um, Although, sometimes that movement can be really good. So then maybe you want to do wall push-ups. Hand fidgets can be very helpful if used properly. My thing about hand fidgets is that they shouldn't necessarily be toys, but there can be some good benefits from hand fidgets. Palm squeezes. So in the middle of your palm here, this is your Babkin reflex. And so our Babkin reflex can give us a lot of good messages, again, to our brain for calming. So even just having, sometimes you'll see people who are nervous, maybe kind of, writhe their hands a bit. So, but even just doing some pressure in the middle of the palm. And then I also like to teach kids finger munchies. That's what we call them. So you're just squeezing down the finger and then pulling off. Again, we always, have our hands with us, so it's a good fidget and can be a really good activity break. So this is really just looking at the importance of the mouth, and oftentimes when we see tongues hanging out and the mouth involved when we're concentrating, it's because our central nervous system is needing that. And so or you'll have those kids who maybe are chewing on their shirts or chewing on pencils, that type of thing. The best thing that can be done is not necessarily expect that won't happen, but maybe replace it with something more beneficial. So like maybe a chewy necklace, or if you allow gum in your classroom, or a water bottle, those can all be good replacements for that oral stimulation. And so I list some of those. I really like the Camelback water bottles just because they have a bigger mouthpiece. And I'm not getting any money from Camelback. There's other brands too that have the bigger mouthpiece, but you have to bite and suck a little bit on those. So those can be just nice recommendations. So, and then, yeah, chewy necklaces, they've really come a long way in those. They make some really nice ones that are pretty age appropriate, even for older kids. And so jewelry is one brand, but you can probably just Google search chewy necklace and find a lot of different options. So tactile activities. So, just even noticing that sometimes clothing preferences are a big thing for kids. And sometimes you'll maybe have students who want to wear their coat all the time, or, maybe aren't dressing necessarily for the weather that you think it's appropriate. And so that would be maybe one clue that maybe interoception is a concern. But also just realizing that, they might get some nice deep pressure, extra heaviness from some of those clothing preferences. And so it maybe, is something that's actually helping. And then, yeah, we talked about deep pressure. Um, Pencil grips is usually a question I get asked. Sometimes there's pencil grips that give a little more tactile input, or if a child doesn't like how a pencil feels, um, that can be helpful. But otherwise, I'm not a huge pencil grip person. I'd rather work on other ways to improve how we hold the pencil. Figure eights is a nice tactile activity. So it's just a good way, like if you were going to rub a child's back, instead of just going up and down, you would go around in a figure eight position. Proprioception activities, really, again, this is that heavy work. And so sometimes stretchy bands on the bottom of chairs can be helpful because kids will get that input through their feet. Deep pressure hugs. You can have kids do, self hugs, push-ups. All of those are going to give really good input to the brain. Here's some more balance and movement activities. So incorporating, jumping, rolling, rocking, spinning. Animal walks is a really good way to incorporate some different head positions. So, bear walks, crab walks, having kids make up different animal walks. I get some of my best ones from that. Tea stools, or flexible seating is something that schools are moving to. So sitting on a ball, sitting on a move and sit cushion. I think the biggest takeaway from some of these is making sure that a child actually needs to move more versus a child whose balance just doesn't allow him to be still. And so, it's sometimes way easier to move, and our core actually might be working harder if we're sitting still. And so sometimes we offer flexible seating options, or that type of thing, because it's a child who's moving all the time. But if we really investigate further, we notice that they're only moving that much because they actually aren't able to engage their core enough to be still. So yeah, some vision and sight activities. So I think, even thinking about lighting, maybe you vary from your fluorescent lighting or to natural lighting if you have windows. Looking at, colors of paper and the writing, the print color, the font color, that varying that can be helpful for some kids. Removing some of the visual information from the paper. So sometimes there's just too much on a paper. And so realizing like, oh, maybe we need to cover part of the paper, or you can, maybe make a box, and then the child moves the box along for like a math homework paper. And then auditory activities. So we talked a little bit about music and how that can be helpful, but realize that sometimes it isn't. Sometimes it's too much. Noise canceling headphones can be a really nice option for those kids who need to have reduced sound. And so offering that can be a good idea. I have ear dominance written down there. So you really want to make sure that we've got, the child's ear dominance is their dominant ear is near closer to the teacher, to the instruction. And so that will, especially for those kids who maybe have a little bit slower processing, that can be helpful. So, okay, now we're to the time for questions. I do have this QR code. So, especially if maybe you're a homeschool parent, and you're curious and want more information, you can scan that, and we do free screens. Also, if you're a classroom teacher, that's always something you can offer or recommend. I know that we're kind of from all over on this webinar, and so we do those free screens in our Des Moines, Ames, Oskaloosa, Pella, and Newton locations. And so that is always an option.